Today's daf is daf mem beis, and we're going to begin with Mesvei on daf mem aleph amud beis, the last two lines on the amud. Now, just as a segue into this Mesvei, we'll mention that Reish Lakish had a particular interpretation of Reb Meir, according to which Rabbi Meir agrees that ein pigul lechatzi matir, which means that pigul could only register and generate an Isur Kores if the Machsheves pigul was on all the avodos. However, according to Reish Lakish, Reb Meir's chiddush is that ein adam osa el al das rishona, so that if he did one avoda, the first, with a machshavas pigul, and then he had a shtika, in which case he said nothing, then the assumption is that that shtika is really a machshavas pigul because it is a continuation of his original machshavas pigul. Meisvei, the Gemara now challenges this from a brisa, Bameh dvarim amurim. When do we say that if he had a machsheves pigul of chutz lizmano during one particular avoda, it generates and effectuates a pigul? That's bidomim hanitonim al mizbeach hachitzon. So we're talking now about the chatos chitzonios that are brought on the mizbeach hanachoshes, the mizbach hanachoshes in the azora outside the heichal. And here we start today's daf on daf mem beis. Avol hadomim hanitomim al hamizbeach hapnimi. Now, in the case of a chatos pnimis, the Torah requires that all four matanos are implemented and are indispensable, are critical to the avodas hakorban. On Yom Kippur, in addition to the zrika times four on the four corners of the mizbach mizbeach hapnimi, there were an entire set of hazoyos in which the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur had to do these hazoyos, these sprinklings of the dam. And the total number here, as you'll see in the Bryce on the top of Mem Beis, is Arboim V'Shalosh Shal Yom HaKippurim. All told, 43 hazoyos. So let's see if we can calculate how the Bryce came up with the number 43. Later on, the Gemara is going to bring another brisa that has 47, but we're now focused on the number 43. So it works like this. The avoda that we're talking about on Yom Kippur is the avoda of the par and the soyer. So we'll start with the par, and we begin with lifnai v'lifnim inside the Kodesh Kadoshim, in which case the Kohen Gadol has to do hazoyos keneged the kapores. The kapores is the covering over the aron that housed the shtei luchos habris, and in with the dam of the par, after the par was shechted in the azora, the dam in the klishores is taken by the Kohen Gadol inside Lifnai v'lifnim, the Kodesh Kadoshim, and there he's going to do, all told, 8 hazoyos. And the 8 hazoyos include 1 hazoya lamala and sheva lamata. So 1 hazoya is related to the top of the kapores, that's the covering over the aron, and 7 in the direction of the Aron Kodesh on the bottom, below the Kaporis. So now we have a total of 8 Hazoyos. Then the Kohen Gadol leaves the environs of the Kodesh Kodashim, and he goes out into what's called the Heichal. There was no Aron in the Heichal. There was no Kaporis over the Aron. But what there was is two things that are relevant to us right now. In the Heichal, there was the Mizbach HaZohav, and there was the Paroches. And now the Kohen Gadol has to do another set of Hazoyos, Keneged the Paroches. And that's going to be another set of right, is another set of 7 plus 1. And that Sheva Lamala and Achas Lamata against the Parocha, Keneged the Paroches, gives you another 8. So we had 8 in the Kodesh Kodashim. Now we have another 8 in the Heichal, Keneged the Paroches, the curtain. So that's 8 plus 8 is 16. So we're holding now by 16. All that refers to the par. Now we get to the Sa'ir, which was the second major carbon that went Lifnai v'Lifnim. The Dam went Lifnai v'Lifnim. And that's going to give me basically a repeat of another 16 Hazoyos, paralleling, or if you will, imitating the 16 Hazoyos on the Dam HaPar. So now we have 16 Hazoyos on the Dam HaSoyer. So we're now multiplying 16 by 2, and we end up with 32. Now what happens? Now the Kohen Gadol takes what's ever left of the dam of the par and the dam of the soyer after the 16 plus another 16 hazoyos, and he combines them together in one kli. So we're up to now, 16 is 32. What does he do with the dam of taroves of par v'soyer? He does four matanos on the 4 corners of the Mizbach HaZav. In addition to that, he does Sheva Hazoyos on the Mizbach HaZav. So we have 7 plus 4 is 11. And before we had calculated 36, right? 16 times 2, no, I'm sorry, is 16 times 2 is 32. And now we have 4 plus 7 is 11. 11 plus 32 is 43, correct? So we go back to the Brisa, and the Brisa says Arbaim v'Shalosh. So we have 43. Now, the Brisa continues, and it says, Achad asar shel par Kohen Mashiach, Achad asar shel par Helim Dover shel Tzibur. Okay, so again, these are other korbanos that are chatos pnimios, and he calculates, the different hazoyos of the par Kohen Gadol and the par Helim Dover shel Tzibur. Each one gives you 11 because they're going to be 7 hazoyos plus 4 matanos on the 4 corners of the Mizbeach HaPnimi is 7 and 4 is 11. Oh, now we get to the punchline for our purposes. Pigel bein barishona bein b'shniya bein b'shlishis. The Gemara is going to vacillate back and forth what that means. But at this point, the Gemara thinks that he had to have a machsheves pigel, number one, on the hazayos in the Kodesh Kodashim, number two, on the hazayos in the Heichel, and number three, on the hazayos on the four corners of the Mizbeach. And therefore, a Meir Omer, pigel v'chayovn le'kares. V'chachamim omrim, ein bo kares ad sheyafagel b'kol hamatir. Now, the Chachamim say that ein pigel b'chatzi matir, therefore he has to be mafagel with a machshavas pigel on the entire matir, which means all 43 hazayos on Yom Kippurim, and in the case of other chatos pnimius on all 11 hazayos, because all these hazayos are critical, and anything less than all these hazayos would be a chatzi matir, and the Rabbanan hold ein pigel v'chatzi matir. So he has to have pigel on all 43 hazayos, or on the 11 and the 11. Reb Meir says, no, that if he had a machshavas pigel on any one of those three sets that we mentioned, whether it's Heichal, let's start with Kodesh Kodashim, whether it's Heichal, whether it's on the Al Gabi Mizbeach, that machshavas pigel would engender a chiyuv kares of pigel, ktani miyas, pigel, bein barishona, bein b'shniya, bein b'shlishis, which the Gemara interprets to mean that if he had pigel during any one of these three sets, whether it's the Kodesh Kodashim, the Heichal, or the Mizbeach itself, that would be enough to generate pigel. One second. So Rabbi Meir's Shita, as recorded here in this brisa, would be that if in any one of those three that we mentioned, Kodesh Kodashim, Heichal, or Mizbeach, he had a machshavas pigel, that would be enough to engender pigel. Now, this is a contradiction to Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation of Rabbi Meir's Shita, because it would seem that according to the brisa, even if he had no machshavas pigel on the first set of hazayos, let's call it the hazayos of the Kodesh Kodashim, if he had machshavas pigel on the second set of hazayos in the Heichal, or alternatively in the application of the dam, the matanos to the four corners of the Mizbeach Hazov, that itself would generate pigel. Now, how could that be? According to Reish Lakish's interpretation of Meir, you've got to start with a machshavas pigel at the beginning of the avoda in order to generate the principle of ein adam osa el al das rishona. But if his original das was bismano, not shalom bismano, without a machshavas pigel, how could he generate pigel through a machshava on the second or on the third round? It makes no sense according to Reish Lakish. Omer Rabbi Yitzchak bar Ovin, and he's going to try to defend Reish Lakish's interpretation of Rabbi Meir in this brisa. Hachu mayaskinon kigong shepigel b'shchita dechad matirhu. So once again, let's reiterate. According to Reish Lakish, Rabbi Meir agrees that ein pigel b'chatzi matir. However, the brisa is talking in a case where he had a machshavas pigel at the time of the shchita, such that his shchita was with the intention that the dam would be taken out of its time allotment, And in that case, whether or not he, now just 1 second, we talk about Nishpach Adam, just give me 1 second, sorry. Yeah, we're talking about Nishpach Adam, so that what happens is that if, let's say, after the first shechita, right, there's the par and there's the soyer. So let's say that after the shechita of the par, the dam was nishpach. It spilled from the mizrach, from the receptacle onto the floor of the mizbech. He now has to replace that animal with a replacement animal. He has to do a second shechita. And then with the second shechita, he starts with Kabbalas Hadam of the second shechita, and then he does all hazoyos with the second shechita. And soon the Gemara is going to discuss whether or not he has to start from scratch or he could just pick it up where he left off, whatever it is. Anyway, he had an intention of pigul when he shechted the animal whose dam was used either for the first set, meaning in the Kodesh Kodashim, or for the in the second set in the Heichel, or the third on the Mizbeach. And therefore, if that be the case, then he's got a machshava for a complete matir. Because if the shechita was followed by, let's say, Kabbalah and Holacha and Zrika, Kihulchasa with the right intention, but he had a machshava of Chutz Lizmano at the time of the shechita, that is pigul. Why? Because the korban is perfect except for the machsheves chutz lizmano that he had at the time of the shechita. And pigul depends upon the fact that all the avodas were done perfectly and could have generated the kapara except for the fact that the shechita was done with a machshav of chutz lizmano. So if that be the case, again, we're going to have trouble fitting this to the language, the text of the Brisa, which says Bein v'Rishona, Bein v'Shniya, Bein v'Shlishis. But basically what we're saying is that Bein Shenishpach Adam of the Shechita Rishona, Bein Shenishpach Adam Shniya, when he does a replacement Shechita, that Machsheves Pigul at the time for the second set, for example, or the third set, would generate Pigul. Frekti Gemari Hachi, my time of the Rabbanon. Now we have to understand the Shita of the Rabbanon. Because clearly, if you're telling me that according to this interpretation of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Rav Yitzchak bar Oven, and to defend Reish Lakish's opinion that even Rav Meir concedes that ein pigul b'chatzi matir, if that be the case, there's a pigul here of the full matir at the time of his machshavas chutzes mano of shchita, then why would the Rabbanon disagree with that? Omar Rava, man chachamim Rabbi Eliezer he. Or Rabbi Lazar, depending on the girsa. Now we're going to study the Shita Rabbi Lazar. Tisnan, and this Mishnah is at the end of Masechta Zevachim, and okay, let's first, instead of giving all the hakdamos, let's just read the text of the Mishnah. Tisnan. Hakomitz valavon v'aktoros u'minchas kohen u'minchas kohen mashiach u'minchas nesachim shehikriv me'achas mehem kizayis b'chutz chayev, and Rabbi Loza is going to disagree. Poter ad sheyakriv es kulam. Okay. Now, what is the common denominator on this list in the Mishnah at the end of Masechta Zevachim? This is a list of karbanos mincha. There are various karbanos mincha. In some cases, let's call it a classic case, the mincha requires both kometz and levona. And when he does the haktorah of both kometz and levana, it's matir the rest of the mincha for achila. In the case of ktores, there's only one single matir, and that is, when the fire, a pillar of smoke goes up to the heavens. Minchas Kohanim does not have kmitza. A Kohen brings a mincha, the entire mincha is muktar, is burnt on the Mizbeach. And the same thing will apply to Minchas Kohen Mashiach and Minchas Nesachim. Now, Minchas Nesachim, again, this is way, forward, in our study of Kodshim, but just the ABC, Minchas Nesachim means that every single carbon, let's say I bring a carbon shlamim, it has to be accompanied by a mincha. But not only that, there's such a thing as a Minchas Nesachim, which is Bab in Nidava, as a separate Nidava. It doesn't accompany any carbon. In any event, now the Mishnah records a machlokas tanoim between the Tanakama, the Rabbanan, and Rabbi Lazar. What happens as far as shchutei chutz? Meaning, if he takes the dam, or in the case of menachos, he takes the kometz, he takes the levona, he takes the ketores, and so forth and so on outside, and he's makrif it on his own self-made mizbeach outside the Beis Hamikdash. Is he chayav for shchutei chutz if he only takes one kizayis? Now, as far as the aktorah of these menachos are concerned, or in the case of ketores, the aktorah is complete; it's total. However, the Rabbanan are of the opinion, here the first shita quoted here in this Mishnah, that a kizayis is also called a maisa akrava. And we'll see that there are various nafkaminas, but one of them is, would he be chayiv for chutz? And the answer is the Rabbanan hold that if he took a kizayis of the kometz, of the levona, of the ketores, and he burnt it outside, on a mizbeach outside the mikdash, he'd be chayiv kares for that. Rabbi Lazar, on the other hand, says no. Achi Yaakov is kula. He's not willing to recognize the fact that a kizayis constitutes and qualifies as a ketara, as a maisa ketara. He wants to create a mirror image between the chiyuv of chutz and the full-fledged kiyum of the avoda bifnim. And the full-fledged avoda bifnim requires that the entire mincha be burnt on the mizbeach, the entire ketores be burnt on the mizbeach. Nothing less will do, and therefore you can only be chayiv for chutz if you do the entire avoda. And now the Gemara is suggesting that since Rabbi Lazar is of the opinion that the avoda is not considered avoda if you break it down into smaller segments of a kizayis each, but rather you require the entire avoda in order for it to qualify for the avoda. Therefore, the so-called Rabbanon who disagree with Rabbi Meir in our brisa, they are of the opinion of Rabbi Lazar, and they hold that you cannot effectuate pigul unless the machshavas pigul was on the entire avoda. And that reflects an extension or an application of Rabbi Lazar's shita that you're not chayav for chutz unless you have a haktorah on the entire avoda. So the Gemara rejects this. Why? Ha'amar Rava made a statement, or Rama, whoever it is, Moda Rabbi Lazar b'damim. If somebody took dam of a carbon that was shechted bifnim inside the Beis Hamikdash, and he took that dam and he did an avoda with that dam b'chutz, Rava claims that Rabbi Lezer in this case would admit that he's chayiv kares. Disnan, because Rava based his conclusion on a Mishnah in Masechta Yom on Daf Samach. Rabbi Lezer, Reb Shimon Omrim. Okay, so now remember that we discussed the Avodas Yom Kippurim in terms of the Hazoyos in the Heichal or in the Kodesh Kadoshim, and the matanos on the Mizbeach Hazav in the Heichal. So we spoke about situations where, let's say there was Nishpach Adam after one set of Hazoyos, and now what he has to do is he has to shecht a replacement animal, a replacement carbon, and take the dam and do the Hazoyos with that dam. And the question is, where does he start from? So Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon are of the opinion, mimakom shepasak misham hu maschil. He doesn't have to go back and start from scratch and do the hazoyos and repeat the hazoyos that he did, whether it be in the Kodesh Kodashim, whether it be in the Heichal. No. When he replaces it with the dam, because the dam was nishpach, and he goes on, he picks up exactly where he left off. And he doesn't have to repeat those previous hazoyos that he achieved before the dam was nishpach, before it spilled on the floor. The Chachamim, on the other hand, reject the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon, and they hold that if the dam was nishpach, then when you bring the second animal to replace the first one, and you start with the dam, you got to start from scratch and replace all the hazoyos of the original. Now, the Gemara wants to make a comparison, an analogy to the laws of Pigul. And if we're saying that the laws of Chutz equal the laws of Pigul, and therefore Rabbi Elazar has to hold that Pigul, even during one of those sets of Hazoyos, would effectuate Pigul, then certainly, if he had a Machsheves Pigul during the shechita of any one of these animals, that should generate pigul. And therefore, again, if the brisa, as we said before, is addressing a metzius, a scenario in which the Kohen had a machshavas pigul during the shechita of one of those animals, then how could the Chacham possibly reject such a thing? It's got to be pigul. Elama rava kigon shepigul b'rishona v'shasak b'shniya v'chazur pigul b'shlishis. Rav is willing to interpret this brisa very liberally, in a new kind of a way. And it wasn't that he had a machshavas pigul on each one of these three sets of Kodesh Kodashim, Heichal, and Mizbeach, but rather he had a shtika in the middle. And Reish Lakish is going to interpret Rabbeir as saying that the reason why this is pigul is because Adam Osa al Das Rishona hu Osa. So therefore, when he was Shosek B'Shniya, we assume that he was continuing his Machshavas pigul in the Rishona. So the Gemara asks, if that be the case, what's the chidush here? Why did you break it up into Rishona, Shniya, and Shlishis? I might have thought maybe he's indicating that he is the exception to the rule, and he's not basing himself on the original machshava, because if he did so, mihader pigula b'shlishis lamali. Why did he bother repeating the machshavas pigul on the third round? Kamash Malan, the Bryce wants to tell me, nevertheless, we still believe Kola Osa al Das Rishonu Osa, and the second set with his machshava b'shtika was also machshavas pigul. Maskif Ravashi, how are you going to read the brisa? Midi Shosak Tani. The brisa said that he has a machshavas pigul on the Rishon, the Shni, and the Shlishis. Doesn't say he was Shosei. Elomar Ravashi, Hochamayas Kita. What's the case here in this brisa? Kigon Shev Pigul B'Rishona, Uba Shnia, Uba Shlishis. We're going to take the brisa literally at face value, and he had a machshavas pigul during all three sets. Why is that necessary? I would have thought Isal Kedaita Kola Osa al Das Rishona hu Osa. Mihader Piguli B'chol Chada B'chada Lamali. Why did he have to repeat his kavana, his machshava of pigul over and over and over again? It would have been enough for him to express and verbalize his machshavas pigul on the first set. Why did he trouble himself to repeat his machshavas pigul over and over again 3 times over? The answer is apparently he was not acting on the basis of his original intent. Kamash Balan, therefore the Bryce has to tell me, no, that even though he took the time to repeat his machshavas pigul and express it over and over again, he still is operating on the basis of extending his original machshava and based on that das.